John's farm stretched peacefully at the edge of the neighborhood, a green patch of freedom, surrounded by the neat rows of suburban houses. It was his refuge, a place where the rules of the HOA couldn't reach, where he could nurture his vegetables, raise a few chickens, and breathe in the fresh country air without interference. That morning, a cool fog hung low over the fields, softening the shapes of his crops and dulling the early sunlight. John walked the rows of tomato plants, checking for signs of pests or rot, feeling a deep satisfaction at the fruits of his labor. The quiet was comforting, until a sudden sound shattered it. Crunching footsteps approached through the underbrush. John froze, scanning the edge of his property. Then she appeared. Karen. Her heels sank into the damp soil, her eyes sharp and unblinking as she stepped into view. Clad in a crisp blazer and wielding a smartphone like a weapon, she looked less like a concerned neighbor and more like a warrior on a mission. John's stomach clenched. Without a word of greeting, Karen crossed onto his land, her gaze sweeping over the plants with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm patrolling the neighborhood," she announced in a clipped voice, "and I noticed your farm. Here. You do realize this is against HOA rules, right?" John blinked, taken aback. His farm lay just beyond the HOA boundaries, on property he'd owned for years. "Karen, this isn't part of the HOA. I'm not breaking any rules." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not how it looks. You're illegally farming, and I'm going to make sure the HOA and the authorities know about this." John's heart pounded in his chest. The farm had been his dream, a patch of earth where he could escape the strict neighborhood regulations. Yet here she was, invading his sanctuary, wielding accusations like weapons. "Please, you can't just come onto my property," John said, stepping forward cautiously. "This is private land." Karen's smirk was cold. "I'm doing what's necessary to keep this neighborhood safe and orderly. If you're breaking the rules, I have every right to report it." John's voice tightened. "There are no such rules here. You're trespassing." "I'm protecting the community," she said firmly. "You're the problem." The air between them crackled with tension. John wanted to stand his ground, but a creeping unease settled in his gut. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute. Karen was on a crusade, and his farm was in her crosshairs. As Karen stalked the rows of crops, her phone out, presumably recording, John's mind raced. Why was she so obsessed? What did she hope to gain from this battle? The peaceful life he had built suddenly felt fragile, like a castle of sand before an incoming tide. Before he could say another word, Karen snapped a photo of the sun-dappled tomatoes. "This'll be evidence," she said, voice low but sharp. "I'll see you in court if you don't stop." John watched helplessly as she turned and disappeared back toward the neighborhood, her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The fog seemed thicker now, the once familiar farm feeling foreign, shadowed by the threat she carried. That day, the sun climbed higher, but John's sense of peace never returned. Instead, a dark cloud of uncertainty settled over his land. Karen's patrol wasn't a one-time visit. It was a warning shot in a battle he hadn't wanted to fight, and as the neighborhood buzzed with rumors and whispers, John knew this was only the beginning. John hoped Karen's unexpected intrusion had been a one-off, a misguided neighbor with too much time on her hands. But days passed, and Karen's visits grew more frequent, each one more unsettling than the last. It began with small things. John found flyers taped to his mailbox, warning of illegal activity, and urging neighbors to report suspicious farmings on his land. One morning, his carefully planted rows of lettuce were trampled, the soil disturbed, as if someone had deliberately sent a message. Karen's shadow seemed to lurk everywhere, though no one admitted to seeing her. One afternoon, as John John repaired a broken fence post near the boundary line. He spotted her again, standing across the road with that cold, accusing stare. She raised her phone and began filming, narrating loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Here's the illegal farm," she said, voice dripping with false concern. "Crops grown without permits, violating every rule. We need to stop this before it spreads." John's blood ran cold. The neighborhood had always been friendly. Neighbors chatting over fences and sharing weekend barbecues. But now, whispers followed Karen's visits. The question wasn't just if John was breaking the law. It was whether he could be trusted at all. He tried to confront her once more. "Karen, please stop this," John said, voice strained. "I've done nothing wrong. You're hurting more than helping." Karen's smile was sharp, almost cruel. "I'm doing my duty. If you won't listen, the authorities will." That same evening, a knock at John's door startled him. Outside stood 2 police officers, their expressions neutral, but serious. "Someone filed a complaint about your farming activities," one said. "We're here to check if you're in violation of any local ordinances." John's heart thudded. He showed them around, explaining the property lines, zoning laws, and how his farm operated completely within legal bounds. But the officers took notes, photographs, and asked pointed questions. Their presence a reminder that Karen's accusations weren't just idle threats. After they left, John paced his kitchen, frustration and fear gnawing at him. Karen's relentless patrols weren't just harassment. They were a strategic assault designed to wear him down. Every knock on the door, every whispered rumor, felt like another layer of pressure squeezing tight. He wasn't alone in feeling the weight. Neighbors who once nodded hello now avoided eye contact. At the local grocery store, conversations hushed when he entered. It was as if Karen's narrative had taken hold, poisoning the community against him. One night, John caught wind of a private neighborhood meeting where Karen's supporters gathered. Rumors swirled that she was rallying them to impose stricter rules, ones that might finally give her the legal teeth to shut down his farm for good. John knew he had to act, but how? Confronting Karen only made her more determined. Fighting the HOA seemed like a giant he couldn't topple, and the longer this went on, the more isolated he felt. Late that night, John stared out across his fields, moonlight washing the crops in silver. This land was his lifeblood, yet it felt like a battlefield. Karen had turned his peaceful farm into a fortress under siege, and the enemy was more relentless than he ever imagined. He clenched his fists, the resolve hardening inside him. If Karen wanted a fight, he would give her one. But this wasn't just about farming anymore. It was about standing up to a force that threatened to control every inch of his life. The question was, how far would Karen go, and how much could he endure before losing everything? The next morning, John's phone buzzed relentlessly. His heart sank as he saw the caller ID. It was the local police department. "Mr. Anderson, this is Officer Martinez. We're coming out to your farm today. We've received a formal complaint alleging illegal farming activity on your property." John's mouth went dry. The complaint wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was official. Karen's relentless patrols had morphed into a weapon, aimed squarely at him. When the officers arrived mid-afternoon, their expressions were serious, but not accusatory. They moved with the authority of the law, walking every inch of John's land, inspecting crops, examining sheds, and photographing every detail. John answered their questions as calmly as he could, but inside, his mind raced. He remembered Karen's cold gaze, the smug satisfaction she wore like armor when she saw the police arriving. Was this the end of his freedom? Would he be branded a criminal for simply tending to his land? As the officers wrapped up their inspection, one of them pulled John aside quietly. "Mr. Anderson, the complaint cites some obscure HOA rule about agricultural activity within the neighborhood boundaries. We're going to review the zoning and check with the HOA, but for now, there's no immediate action. Just be prepared for possible follow-up." John nodded, though unease settled deep in his chest. The officers left, but the invisible shadow of Karen's accusations lingered like smoke. Word spread fast. Neighbors began casting wary glances, murmuring about John's illegal farm. Friends who once stopped to chat now crossed the street to avoid him. The social fabric John had, carefully woven, began to fray, unraveling under the weight of suspicion. But Karen wasn't done. Fueled by her newfound leverage, she stepped up her campaign. She posted flyers around the neighborhood, warning residents about John's violations. She called local news stations, spinning a story of a rogue farmer flouting the rules, risking the community's safety. John's phone rang constantly, with questions from neighbors, reporters, even strangers. His sanctuary was shrinking by the hour. One evening, he found his gate spray-painted with words that cut deeper than any legal threat. "Stop the illegal farm." The message was clear. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about fear, intimidation, control. John's wife, Emily, watched helplessly as the stress took its toll. "We can fight this," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "But we need to be smart." John nodded, but doubts gnawed at him. How could one person wield such power? Karen's crusade was no longer about the neighborhood. It was personal. That night, as John lay awake, his mind replayed every moment. Karen's trespass, the police visit, the whispered rumors. He realized this battle wasn't just for his farm. It was for his dignity, his freedom, and his place in the community. He decided then he wouldn't back down, not without a fight. But the question that haunted him was chilling. How far would Karen go to see him silenced? And would the truth be enough to save him from the storm she had unleashed? The neighborhood John once knew was cracking. The lines, drawn by Karen's relentless campaign, weren't just between him and her. They cut through families, friendships, and front porches. The peaceful suburb had become a battlefield, cloaked in polite smiles and sideways glances. At first, the split was subtle. Some neighbors whispered in hushed tones about John's illegal farm, worried about the precedent it might set. Others shook their heads, whispering that Karen had gone too far. But soon, the division became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, John spotted Mrs. Henderson, his longtime neighbor, watering her garden across the street. Their eyes met, but instead of the warm smile she usually gave, she looked away quickly, her lips pressed into a tight line. John's heart sank. He'd never felt so alone. The neighborhood Facebook group was aflame with posts. Karen's supporters praised her vigilance, calling John a lawbreaker and a threat to the community's order. Others defended John, accusing Karen of bullying and abuse of power. Comments escalated, friendships frayed, and the once friendly online space became a battleground of accusations and defenses. John's mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes. Some warned him to play by the rules, others threatened legal action, and a few offered quiet support, but all carried the weight of fear and tension. At the grocery store, John overheard two neighbors discussing him in the next aisle. "If he's breaking the rules, why won't the HOA do something?" One whispered. The other replied, "Karen's on it. She's not backing down anytime soon." John's world had shifted. The farm, once a sanctuary, now felt like a spotlight, under which every move was scrutinized. He began to notice subtle changes. Neighbors closing their curtains when he walked by, whispered conversations, halting abruptly. But beneath the surface, darker currents flowed. John heard rumors that Karen had old grudges against some residents, using the HOA complaints as weapons to settle scores. He discovered hints that Karen's so-called patrols were more than casual neighborhood watches. They were targeted campaigns aimed at anyone who crossed her. One evening, John's friend Marcus dropped by. Marcus had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and knew its history well. Karen's not just about rules, Marcus said quietly. She's got a personal vendetta. A few years back, she lost a property dispute and never forgot. Now she's using the HOA to get her way. John's jaw tightened. How many others has she gone after? More than you think, Marcus replied. People who dared question her or stood in her way. She's playing a long game, and you're just the latest pawn. That revelation hit John hard. This wasn't just a farming dispute. It was a calculated power play, designed to intimidate and control. The quiet neighborhood he'd loved was now a chessboard. And Karen was moving the pieces with ruthless precision. John realized the fight ahead was bigger than zoning laws or HOA bylaws. It was a battle against a force that thrived on fear and division. He looked out across his farm at the fading light, the rows of crops whispering in the evening breeze. The land was still his, but the peace was shattered, and Karen's shadow loomed larger than ever. The question wasn't just if John could prove his innocence. It was whether the community would stand behind him or let Karen win by breaking them apart. John's mind raced as he stared at the tangled mess the conflict had become. It wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about truth, control, and survival. If Karen's campaign was fueled by misinformation and personal grudges, he needed proof, concrete, undeniable proof. That evening, armed with his laptop and a growing resolve, John plunged into a deep dive through local records, HOA documents, and zoning laws. His fingers trembled slightly as he sifted through pages of bylaws and old meeting minutes, searching for any mention of farming restrictions on his property. At first, everything seemed vague. The HOA's official guidelines were broad, ambiguous. At best, with no clear rules about farming outside its jurisdiction, yet Karen's accusations were precise, almost surgical. Digging deeper, John discovered a pattern. Old complaints, strikingly similar to his own, filed by Karen against other residents, people who had questioned her authority, resisted her patrols, or simply refused to comply with her demands. The complaints were peppered with questionable claims, unapproved structures, unauthorized land use, disturbing community peace. Most had been dismissed quietly, but the damage was done. Neighbors had been worn down, coerced, or pushed out. John's heart pounded as he pulled up email chains between Karen and several HOA board members. The messages revealed something chilling. Karen had been lobbying for stricter enforcement policies, pressuring officials to crack down on dissenters. She had even offered to monitor properties herself, effectively deputizing her private vendetta with HOA authority. It was worse than John imagined. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. Karen wasn't a concerned neighbor. She was a manipulator, using the HOA as a weapon, twisting rules, and exploiting fear to control the neighborhood. But there was more. Among the documents, John uncovered an old legal dispute involving Karen and a neighboring property owner, one she had lost but never forgotten. The bitter resentment that had sparked back then now fueled her campaign, morphing personal vendetta into public harassment. John knew he was sitting on explosive evidence. If exposed, Karen's crusade could crumble overnight, but confronting her directly would be risky. She was cunning, ruthless, and deeply embedded in the HOA's inner circle. That night, John paced the floor of his farmhouse, the weight of what he'd found pressing down on him. The fight was no longer about defending his crops or his land. It was about exposing a hidden war of power and control. He thought of his farm bathed in moonlight, a silent witness to the escalating storm. He thought of Karen's cold eyes, the venom behind her smile, and he realized that this was only the beginning. John made a plan. He would gather more proof, document everything meticulously, and prepare to confront the HOA board at the next meeting. If he could sway enough neighbors with the truth, maybe he could turn the tide. But the question remained, would the community listen? Or would Karen's influence and fear-mongering silence him once and for all? As John closed his laptop, the farmhouse seemed quieter than ever. Outside, the night was still, but in the shadows, the battle lines were drawn. The night of the HOA meeting arrived like a storm. John's hands shook as he clutched the stack of printed documents, emails, zoning maps, complaint records, all meticulously organized to expose Karen's campaign of deception. The community center was packed, the air thick with anticipation and unease. John scanned the room. Faces he once called neighbors looked back at him, some curious, some hostile, others silently wary. Karen sat at the front, exuding confidence, her eyes glittering with the thrill of battle. She smiled thinly when she spotted him. A silent dare. When the chair called the meeting to order, John's heart hammered. This was his moment, the chance to reveal the truth and reclaim his farm. He stood and addressed the room, his voice steady but charged. I want to talk about the accusations against my farm and the real story behind them. He laid out the evidence. Karen's string of complaints, her lobbying for harsher rules, her personal grudges disguised as concern. He showed the email threads, the dismissed complaints, the neighborhood division she had fomented. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces softened. Others grew defensive. Karen shot back quickly. These accusations are baseless and defamatory. I'm protecting this neighborhood from chaos and lawlessness. A tense silence fell. Then a few voices rose. Neighbors who had seen Karen's patrols firsthand, who felt harassed or silenced. Slowly the tide seemed to shift. But just as John felt hope rising, Karen dropped her final move. I have also received reports that Mr. Anderson's farming violates state agricultural codes, she said, voice cold. We must consider the legal implications. If he's operating without proper permits, the HOA is compelled to act. The room buzzed with unease. John's stomach dropped. He had prepared for many attacks, but not this. Karen's words cast a new shadow. The battle was no longer just about HOA bylaws, but about potential legal trouble. And Karen's influence had pushed it to a higher level. John's mind raced. He needed a way to prove his compliance with the law, to show the community he was, not the villain. After the meeting, as neighbors filed out, John was approached by a handful of supporters, people who believed in him and wanted to help. They urged him to get official documentation, proving his farm was legal and above board. But Karen's smirk lingered in his mind. She wasn't finished. Her campaign was escalating, becoming more aggressive and personal. That night, John found a threatening note slipped under his door. Stop farming or face the consequences. The message was clear. Karen had crossed a line. This was no longer a battle of words. It was intimidation. John felt the weight of the fight settle deep in his bones. The stakes were higher than ever. His farm, his reputation, and his safety were all on the line. But he wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but the truth was, his strongest weapon, and with every challenge, his resolve only grew. The threat under John's door rattled him more than he expected. For the first time since Karen's campaign began, fear crept into his thoughts. Was this just words? Or had Karen crossed the line into something more dangerous? Determined not to show weakness, John doubled down on his efforts. He scheduled an appointment with the county agricultural office to obtain all necessary permits and documentation proving his farm's compliance. Every step was carefully documented. Photographs, signed forms, receipts, proof against any future claims. But Karen's pressure didn't ease. The neighborhood's hostility intensified. One evening, John returned home to find his tractor vandalized, tires slashed, engine tampered with. It was a clear message: stop or suffer the consequences. John reported the vandalism to the police, but the investigation felt slow, and the threat loomed larger than ever. One afternoon, while meeting with a local farmer at a nearby market, John encountered an unexpected figure. Linda, a former HOA board member who had quietly resigned months ago. She approached cautiously, her eyes full of sympathy. "I know what you're going through," Linda whispered. "Karen's been a problem for a long time, but few have had the courage to stand up. I have evidence, documents, recordings, that show how she's manipulated the HOA and the neighborhood." John's pulse quickened. Could this be the break he needed? Linda handed him a small USB drive. "Be careful, Karen's influence runs deep. But with this, you can expose her." That night, John plugged the drive into his computer. The files were damning. Audio recordings of Karen pressuring HOA members, manipulated vote tallies, secret meetings plotting against dissenters. It was a covert operation to control the neighborhood, and his farm was the latest target. John realized this was more than just a fight for his property. It was a battle against a corrupt system, masked by a veneer of community spirit. The risk was huge. If Karen discovered Linda's betrayal, both of their safety could be in jeopardy. John debated his next move. He could confront the HOA board publicly, but Karen's supporters still held sway. Or he could gather more neighbors quietly, building a coalition before making the evidence known. He chose caution. John began reaching out to neighbors privately, sharing parts of the evidence, listening to their stories of intimidation and fear. Slowly, a network formed, a group ready to stand against Karen's reign. Hope sparked where once there was only isolation. But the clock was ticking. One evening, John received an anonymous message. "Stop digging, or your secrets will be buried forever." The chilling warning was clear. Karen wasn't just fighting to protect the neighborhood. She was fighting to keep her power, no matter the cost. John's resolve hardened. The farm was his home, and he wouldn't let fear drive him away. With new allies at his side, John prepared for the final battle, one that would decide the future of the neighborhood and his place within it. The night before the decisive HOA meeting, John barely slept. His mind swirled with strategy, hope, and fear. The USB drive's contents were his trump card, proof that Karen's crusade was fueled by manipulation and malice, not community spirit. John knew the stakes. This meeting would determine not only the fate of his farm, but the soul of the entire neighborhood. The community center buzzed with tension when John arrived. Karen was there early, surrounded by her loyal supporters, her cold smile sharper than ever. When the meeting began, Karen launched into her usual tirade, accusing John of breaking the law and threatening the neighborhood's peace. Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some nodded in agreement, Others exchanged uncertain glances. Then John stood, holding the USB drive like a shield. It's time the truth came out. He played the recordings. Karen's voice filled the room, pressuring board members, twisting votes, and scheming to intimidate residents who opposed her. The evidence was undeniable. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Faces that had once looked suspicious or hostile now looked shocked and betrayed. Karen's smile faltered, then disappeared altogether. Several board members stood and apologized for their complicity. Others pledged to reform the HOA and investigate all complaints fairly. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to dismiss all complaints against John's farm and launch an independent inquiry into Karen's conduct. But just as John breathed a sigh of relief, a new twist emerged. Karen's lawyer stepped forward, announcing a lawsuit against John, not for illegal farming, but for defamation and harassment. The room froze. John's victory was not yet complete. Karen's final gambit aimed to silence him forever. But John was ready. He'd documented everything: the vandalism, threats, Karen's false complaints, and now, backed by the community's renewed support and Linda's evidence, he was prepared to fight. In the days that followed, Karen's influence waned as neighbors rallied behind John. The lawsuit dragged on, but it only strengthened John's resolve and unity within the community. Months later, the neighborhood was transformed. The HOA was restructured with transparent leadership, and trust slowly rebuilt. John's farm flourished, no longer a battleground, but a symbol of resilience and hope. And Karen, she faded from the neighborhood, her reign of fear broken. John stood once more in his fields, the sun warming his face, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. He smiled, knowing he had defended more than just his farm. He had defended his home and the community's soul.